Hi everyone. I recently spoke to activist and spokesperson for the Galilee Blockade group, Ben Pennings. We had a fascinating interview about his life and activism, as well as the big thing that's going on now, his battle against the mining giant Adani. So I hope you enjoy the interview. Please subscribe and let me know what you think of the interview in the comments. Hey Ben, how's it going?
Hi, Tim. How are you? I'm good, thanks.
Yeah, pretty good here in sunny WA and everything. Thanks for coming on the show. I guess it's really important to tell your story. So, yeah, what have you been up to like more recently?
Well, yeah, the unfortunately the court cases stopped me doing some things in the Stop Adani movement, but I've been involved in doing other bits and pieces behind the scenes and sticking with my Supreme Court order. But as you know, it's sort of associated similar timing with COVID. So yeah, my wife and I own a psychology practice, and the demand for mental health services around the country has skyrocketed. So I've been more working on the business and the operational side of that and really increasing the capacity of our service, but also beyond that to be able to meet some of the mental health demands that are out there for adults, kids, couples. So yeah, something a little bit different for me.
Absolutely. And I think what we might do is the state of the world's in a pretty bad place yeah, at the moment. What we might do is we might go back to a bit into your past. Now, there's a lot of things that have happened, since the 90s, and I've looked at, you've got an extensive background in activism, but I think a lot of people want to know, what lit that fire and where, I've met a lot of people on these campaign trails from different walks of life, former
Yeah.
prison guards, to former, accountants, all on picket lines today, dealing with issues that are quite important to them. And just in knowing, where they've come from, I think is quite important. So, from what I understand, you came from regional New South Wales.
Actually, far western Sydney. Well, I moved around a little bit. My dad's a conservative Christian minister, so part of that was sort of moving from place to place. But I most of my adolescence was in far western Sydney in a very working welfare class area, which definitely had an impact. And I got involved and interested in politics from a reasonably young age. And those days, far western Sydney was very, very Labor heavy and centric. But through watching some of the Franklin Dam stuff on TV, like, parents watched ABC News at 7 o'clock every night type thing, I garnered some, I don't know, ecological consciousness, I suppose, and seeing some of that and have always had that interest. And yeah, moved to Tassie when I was 15. And yeah, I actually became quite anti green for a while there. And yes, I've told Christine Milne this a couple of times. Yeah, she was in the midst of a pulp mill fight when I was in my late teens, and I think I told her I didn't actually like the sound of her voice on TV as a teenager or some
That
things like that.
would have
But
gone
again,
down well.
sort of the environmental, fights in Tasmania, I was aware of those, but it wasn't, too long after that that as you are as a teenager, you look at different things and gain different perspectives. And I was working for Greenpeace while I was 18 years old. So, um, yeah,
And that was around the early 90s, right? That was.
yeah, that was late 80s, early 90s. I think I started working for Greenpeace, just knocking on doors and garnering, support in 1990 or 91, probably 1990.
Yep. And did that? I guess, like, is your family? Did they feel as though, obviously, you mentioned your father and everything? Did that bring you into conflict with your family over different belief systems and?
Yeah, it was. Yeah, they still don't like Greenpeace, I think.
Okay.
That was the start of it all. But it was like, it's one of those things when
Yep.
you have choices in life. Like, I was first year university. One of the options I had with regards to part time work was join the Army Reserve, for an example. And I think I was still 17. Like, I actually had to get my mum or dad to sign off on, join the Army Reserve. And they were like, no, focus on your studies and whatever. And, wasn't too far afterwards, I was, working for Greenpeace and, being exposed to different people and ideas. And it was a very cloistered environment, to a point that I grew up with Christian church and Christian school and, all that sort of stuff. And it was also involved, like, I've always been interested in social justice. And as a, young person, I joined like a multi denomination group of people helping young homeless people in our area in Hobart. and I met Christians that were, that weren't anti-abortion or were fine with gay and lesbian people, and that just sort of blew my mind at the time because I was just so used to this very conservative way of thinking about those issues. So that got me, reading things like more radical theology, like creation spirituality or liberation theology, and that really moved my perspective in a religious way, I suppose. But ultimately, I moved away from the church, altogether, which was really challenging for my parents in particular. And it wasn't until my first child was born, which is about 22 years ago. So now that their first grandchild, that brought us back together a little bit. Um, and yeah, get on really well with them. They have always, they've always loved the social justice things that I've done in a more of a charity model. So, I used to run a homeless street choir, or I used to run the Big Issue magazine in Brisbane, for example, and they've liked that sort of model. But anything that's involved politics or, system change or whatever it may be, they've always found very challenging.
Yeah, I guess especially growing up in a sort of, there's been a lot of change since the 90s in Australia and I guess worldwide, and a lot of those changes they're coming to sort of a collision course right today. Do you, I don't know, do you have that sort of like, it's very, when you're working on a campaign dealing with people's issues directly, like you were running charities and so forth, did the other issues start to creep in, like Greenpeace were obviously heavily involved in anti-nuclear, different issues with the forestry and oceans and so forth. Is that the thing that really sparked your interest about more world affairs and got you thinking about things globally?
Yeah, well, it's been a range of things. Like I've always had a sense of calling, and I know that I've got that from my parents. My dad, and my mum are very dedicated to the church and church community, and had that sense of calling, and that's something which I definitely learnt um, from them, but in a different way. And I've always done this, like since I was at age 18. I've always worked in community environmental work. But I suppose, yeah, doing some of that work, in the charity model, and knowing about the justice model, and seeing yourself as a band-aid in many ways. You're sort of a band-aid to some of the bigger systemic issues. There's always a desire to, go out and work on some of the bigger, political and other changes that are needed, cultural changes, so that as many band-aids aren't needed. But doing that, frontline support work with people is so important. And my wife's a psychologist. We own a psychology, practice. We know that people have experienced trauma and relationship breakdown, and mental illness of various types, and it's really important for them to be able to support them. But if you're looking at bigger picture change, it is just a band-aid for many, what I see anyway, is bigger injustice and systemic issues that affect multitudes of people. So I've got that desire, just personally anyway, to work on that political, social, sociological level to, improve some systems and economic systems and the way we live, to minimize the impact down the line, I suppose.
Mm. And is that the thing that got you when you looked at, obviously you ran into Christine Milne, and did you start to see the connection between the actual outcomes, policy outcomes, and what you're fighting on the ground? Is that what sort of led you into being more politically active, and you started thinking about who you might support? Obviously, the elections come around every 2 to 3, 4 years in Australia.
Well,
So
I didn't get involved in the Greens party until 2001 or whatever it was, and I'm one of those many, many, Greens of my age who got involved because of Tampa.
yep,
So it was the Tampa affair. I'd never really voted for Labor. I'd always voted for Democrats or Greens if I could, but I wasn't as actively involved in electoral politics. But seeing the Labor Party's response to the Tampa crisis, seeing what Bob Brown in particular, was doing, and he seemed to be the sole voice on the news, arguing for, for compassion and better policy, really, led me to join the party and get involved and be a, what's the word for it? Yeah, become a candidate and get active and push for, for ultimately it's, yeah, electoral politics has limits, obviously, but yeah, we know that better policy has real effects, on the ground, and helps, move the country and move the populace as well.
yeah, I think that was a significant issue for me because I wasn't involved with politics at the time. I was early 20s, like 2021, and I think there's something to say about when you see other human beings being hurt, it hits you regardless, and you don't really look at um, the political colors of the thing. You just see people, and you see who's doing the bad to these other human beings. I think a lot of people were hit at that time. And did you at that time? Were you still in Tasmania?
No, no, that was definitely back in Brisbane. I moved to Brisbane to do a Greenpeace job when I was like 19. So I've been here for 30 years now as my whole adult life. But, to me, it was, and again, it's like got this interesting family background, even though my parents are conservative and very conservative, had to try and stop them voting for Peter Dutton over the years. When they were living in that electorate, it was very much, my dad came after World War II from the Netherlands. His family experienced significant trauma in the war. My grandfather was involved in the Dutch resistance and, taken by the Nazis. And, I won't say what my grandmother happened with her family, but it's pretty horrible stuff. And know that they didn't come as refugees, but, they were coming from war and escaping war. And there was, and they went into a migrant camp, which is reasonably similar to a refugee camp, these days. And have seen some of those experiences, um, and know that they've contributed to this country, and they're both very service orientated people, and have helped so many people, within church communities and hospitals and schools and whatever through their whole lives. You know, you can't imagine the most conservative politician would want them not to have come here to live the life that they've lived.
Yeah, and did that and seeing that struggle and seeing your actions, did that move, like, I guess, did they um so it was just a natural course for you, because I did read that you got involved in electoral politics around 2004 when you run for the Brisbane council. Was that a hard decision to make, casting your mind back to going, okay, I'm going to join a political party, and I think this is the avenue for change, after sort of moving out of that more Greenpeace sort of working space? Or is that,
Well,
yeah,
I was involved in the party just in my local branch.
yep,
I just through some of the work that I was doing on the ground, I had a little bit of a media profile as well, and I thought I'll stand for pre-selection for what was the best seat at the time in the council. There's a Greens councillor there now, Jonathan Shree, and I actually didn't win the pre-selection. There was a longer term, member did, but he got unwell, so I just stepped in and I had no idea what I was doing. I really didn't in so many ways, but I got 25% of the vote, which was great. I just wanted to help out and, contribute to the growth of the party in that area. Whereas now, both local and state, and probably after this election, we'll have federal members in that area with the Greens, which will be really good to see. And it's nice to be involved, 20 years or so ago, back in the early days.
yeah. And did you at any point back then, after you saw that 20, that's quite a huge vote, 25% of that council election, and obviously probably running a campaign on very low sort of resources apart from people power. Did that sort of give you another sort of kick and motivation to do more in the political space?
Not particularly. I think I was a bit exhausted at the end, and life happens, and kids and such things. It was actually after that I went and sort of got the role as the manager of the big issue, and was involved in politics in a bit of a different space, behind the scenes, sort of lobbying for better, homelessness services. And, so it was more behind the scenes rather than, in front. And they both have value. Like the inside track work that NGOs do is really important, as well as the rah rah activists on the street and people doing direct action. I'm a big believer in that. Most of it's important and valuable. We need to have it all, and we need to be, more effective. I'm a massive advocate for nonviolent direct action, and I think that's something that we need, more of in Australia and around the world. And that's something which is very difficult for some people, and not everyone can do it. But those who can, who have got the privilege and the ability to do it, I try and encourage that, because I think the left or the progressive side of politics, for want of a better word, really, you know, fall behind the right and the far right with regards to pushing the envelope. And I think we really need to push, the envelope and change and a group like Extinction Rebellion, which is not really a group, it's a it's a movement. I, am not particularly actively involved in them, but I love seeing many of the things that they do, because of the ultimate, language that they've got of we're in a climate emergency, talking about extinction, talking about human extinction, and really getting people to, get that message across and people understand that, because we know through the research that if people see something as an emergency, they're more likely to act. And there's that real, challenge about getting, everyday people with jobs and partners and kids and whatever to be able to, consider some of those bigger pictures in life.
Mm. And so you you obviously you've done a lot of work. I did also read that you worked at the Big Issue, and you worked against hate crimes, in different capacities. Did did that ever work ever? Do you find it hard to balance all of the things that you're doing at that time? Because obviously, being a sort of young family, um, campaign meetings can drag on quite a bit. There's
Yeah,
a lot. Yeah,
there's always challenges.
yeah,
I suppose I'm fortunate enough to have had, yeah, I've had a bit of that calling and drive. Sort of, usually it's actually difficult at the moment, but normally I don't have much of an issue with regards to the, motivation to stick with be committed to a campaign. I've learnt that I'm only really good at doing one thing at a time as well. So I don't try and take on multiple campaigns. I do too many things, but I try and dedicate myself strongly to what I'm doing. But like for an example, with the hate crime stuff, I was doing work around homophobic hate crime, and yeah, the AIDS Council in Townsville was bombed, and it was my job to go up to Brisbane to Townsville. This is 1999, and going up there, the coordinator of the AIDS Council got stabbed in the car park with a syringe, and there was yeah, and this was after a spate of hate crimes, and there was a Four Corners thing on it, and the whole lot. But yeah, at the same time, my first child was due. I was between Brisbane and Townsville. Soon after she was born, I had to go back up to Townsville, which I found a bit of you know a challenge. So yeah, there is always that juggle with competing priorities in life. But I'm very proudly a family person and very dedicated to my family, and I've fallen into that very middle-aged bloke trap, whereas I've got, work and I've got family, whereas I've actually ignored some of that friendship, social life. I'm actually, at the moment, just started joining a men's group and trying to engage and get some friendships and balance in my life there as well to keep myself sane through some difficult times.
yeah. Absolutely. I think I found the same thing. It's almost like the issues can really narrow your focus to a point where you don't realize the things that are around you immediately, because you're always thinking about the next thing. How did you like, obviously the bombings and like, it's terrible stuff. Did you find did that weigh a lot on you at the time, and do you find that was impacting your personal life? Yeah.
Not particularly. I think I was yeah, I was just responding to what was going on and working with people. And I've always really enjoyed working with people with, similar values and passions and doing that work. Like I've found, yeah, and I've had a lot of. I never really had much personally then. I was just working with the local community who were the ones who were facing it, so I wasn't facing it. The last few years with my more public role in the Stop Adani movement and Galilee Blockade, yeah, I've faced some pretty horrible death threats and stuff online, and had to involve the police and people commenting about where I live in like news limited publications in the comments and things
Yeah.
like that, and had the private investigators follow
Mm.
me around and my wife around and the kids around and all that sort of stuff, and now the Supreme Court case, like that
Yeah.
stuff, like part of me doesn't want to pretend that it's have had an impact.
Hmm.
Like want to be, fuck you, Adani, and it's
Yeah.
all cool and whatever. And that staunch activist type image, but it's impossible not to have an impact, and they
Yeah.
would know that. And having a family, makes that worse to a point. As an
Mm.
I'm, it's interesting. Like they're not particularly worried or engaged in the court case too much, but
Mm.
I worry about the impact on them.
Mhm.
And there's always the potential threat of bankruptcy personally as well, which wouldn't bankrupt my wife as an example, but it would have an impact. And we have half a house in both our names in a business, so yeah, there's that sort of. And I don't think that's highly likely. And
Mm.
Adani's case is reasonably weak in many ways. But
Mm.
even though it's been going 16 months or 17 months, whatever, it's still early days.
Yeah.
So it's a massive Supreme Court case that could be easily 2 more years to go.
Yeah.
So, and that sort of stuff, just always sitting there really, can be a drag as well.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think looking at like what's at stake, you're really these battles against Adani, against over here we have the Stop Scarborough campaign. It's the front line of the climate battle. It will impact us globally for it will blow our carbon commitments, although they're weak as as they are. But you've done a lot of work in that social space at that time, that led you to Adani and what you're doing now. When did the climate issue be the one that you thought, geez, I've really got to throw myself into this and
Yeah,
really fight?
I think it was after my youngest was born, and I had a little bit of time and space to do some reading, and I was reading various books and some more radically systemic change based environmental books, like a whole range of them. And that was getting me thinking in many ways. But also, it's the passage of time. Like, you know, then I'd already been involved in the environment movement on and off for more than 20 years. And, I was very well aware that those 20 years were the most 20 years of destruction ever. And yeah, the modern day environment movement's 50, 60 years old, and they've been the 50, 60 worst years ever with regards to environmental destruction. So, and that's not because of particular failures of the environment movement, although we can always do better. It's because we're, got an economic system which is very much based on, unsustainable growth and destruction and, a consumerist lifestyle. Whereas, I think it was about 1972, 73 when I was born that they've worked out that that was the time we actually started using, going over the Earth's carrying capacity. So we've been doing that for a long time. So yeah, I've got more of an interest in this economic, change, but obviously climate change is sitting in the back there. And my bigger picture perspective of trying to stop coal mine in the Galilee Basin, or whether that's Scarborough or Beetaloo, is buying us time. Because, yeah, like, big picture economic, cultural change takes a long time, and, I'm really astounded by the amazing young people in particular, including a couple of my kids who are involved in this stuff and really care passionately, about this, and I do have a bit of hope and future for, generations, but we have to actually leave them, something habitable enough to, do that hard work and change to economic and social systems that serve them better, serve people around the world better, and obviously look after ecosystems. So, stopping, big fossil fuel projects, to me, it's just buying extra time for people, the wider culture to get its shit together.
Yeah. And do you remember the point where you first heard of Adani? Like, was it a sort of a press release, or or did someone from the community contact you about it?
I was quite aware of the Galilee Basin, and yeah, I was involved in, some more of the pointy end of the environment movement. And yeah, Adani wasn't the first project that was likely in the Galilee Basin. It was actually a company called GBK, or GBK Hancock, I think it was, which is GBK Reddy, who was a different Indian billionaire, and Gina Reinhardt with Hancock Coal had the, what is it, the three mines, the Alpha North and Kevin's Corner, I think. But yeah, they were the most likely to develop the Galilee Basin, first, or exploit rather. And yeah, there's a coal haulage company called Horizon who are going to invest 2.6 billion into that project, which that project needed. So yes, myself and some comrades, for want of a better word, yeah, and there was NGOs involved as well, but we did some more pointy end work with a campaign called Over Our Dead Bodies. Very deliberately provocative, name, and we did some work in that space to convince Horizon, not to invest there, which was successful. Not particularly because of us, because there's a whole range of people doing stuff. They ended up investing some money into the Pilbara, I think it was, but that killed that project because that money was needed. And it was a while later that Adani became more likely because of the proposed, NAIF loan by the LNP government, a friendly Labor government here in Queensland, and Adani became the most likely. He's a ridiculously wealthy individual, Gautam Adani. So and they were very reluctant to use their own money or his own money. But one of the big successes of the Stop Adani movement is that he had to use his own money eventually to build what is a very smaller mine and reasonably unlikely to grow more than it has.
Hmm. And did was it hard work getting the NGOs on board? There is a bit of separation there between, being the front line, willing to get arrested, willing to, do the disruptive things, and then the NGOs do play a role. But was it easy to rally because of just the way that there was no real political opposition to the Galilee project?
Not particularly. There's been a very strong and concerted effort across the movement. So whether that's the NGOs who've come in and out of that campaign for a while, very strong grassroots presence, and both LNP obviously supporting it, Labor supporting it mostly, but depending on different states and different MPs. And obviously the Greens have been a great support. So very soon after we started, I sort of went and chatted with Dina Tali, who was the leader at the time, and let them know what we were planning and doing. And the NGOs came on board, and Bob Brown joined the NGOs to launch what they were doing, which was great. And it was it's been a massive, massive fight. And we, to be, without I suppose Adani have fought ridiculously well, and I can't think of any other company that would have stuck with it given what's happened, and they're not used to it. So they are used to stuff in India, but they get their way in India because of their political connections in many ways, and have treated people there really badly. And whether they're pushing ahead with it just because of the ego of a multi-billionaire, we're not sure. But it's got to a point where they are, they have got a coal pit there, and it's never going to be 60 million ton a year. All the other Galilee Basin projects are extremely unlikely because it's been 11 years, and the economics of coal and fossil fuels has changed a lot in that time.
And do you think I've watched some videos of you confronting some Labor politicians, and which I will include in the comments. I think it's important to give some people a bit of a background to what you've been facing, because you've confronted liberal, conservative politicians, you've confronted Labor politicians, you've obviously taken on Adani, the company. Do you feel as though that they've tried to make an example of you, or do you think it's become more personal now, just to beat you, because you've been a real effective campaigner in this space?
It is hard to know why Adani did this when they did it, when they could have tried it on a year or so earlier, or even a couple of years earlier. And whether they are, I'm not in cahoots, but whether they're talking to conservative politicians or the industry and want me to be made an example of, is a possibility. But there's also, some of the tactics that Galilee Blockade used, they don't like. So whether they're wanting to use this court case to try and expose and maybe block some of the tactics that we used for the benefit of the wider industry, that's possible as well. So when the third party boycott legislation keeps raising its head every now and again, like the last time that happened when Christian Porter was the Attorney General and Morrison was the PM, they were using Galilee Blockade and Market Forces, an NGO, as the example companies, and they were banging on about us in the media as well. So whether they want to really try and knock out or scare people away from the tactics of targeting contractors and banks and insurance companies, it's a possibility. Or it could just be someone, Adani had enough and they just wanted to go me, and they've got the amount of money that Gautam Adani's got, so it's about 125 billion now is his worth. So that's richer than all the billionaires in Australia put together, I'm sure, and he's in the top 10 in the world now. So them spending a few million, having a go at me and dragging it out in the Supreme Court as long as they can, is not a big deal for them.
And what sort of tactics were you using on the ground? Like, what really sort of, when you see people lock on and do things like that, some people, are pretty, like in the broader community, some people are pretty dismissive of it, but it is quite effective. Like, how did you grind some of their operations to a halt?
Well, yeah, well, Galilee Blockade used a whole range of tactics and, yeah, and weren't particularly I think there's, like, 2 lock-ons the whole time. It was very much blockade tactics and, average everyday citizens and mostly older as well. So, yeah, most of the Galley Blockade meetings I was at, I was either, the youngest or second youngest there. So very much sort of, older and retired, people who, care for future generations and care for their, kids and grandkids who've got a bit of, time and energy, but they've also got the wisdom and seen the history of time and seen things that haven't worked and that we've tried, like the politicians always go, well, do a petition or,
Yeah,
whatever it may be.
and it gets
Uh,
lost in a committee or so.
yeah, and the things that
Yeah,
are, effective, they try and,
yeah,
you know, go for us one way or another, whether that's criminal or civil stuff. And yeah, there is the ACT is the only, place in Australia where these slap suits are illegal. There's lots of places in the US and Europe, and yeah, using this strategic litigation to try and stop peaceful protest, yeah, it shouldn't be allowed to happen, but it is legal in Australia, and they're yeah, Adani are trying it on, and it's massive. Like it's the by far the biggest since the Bob Brown and guns case, which was more than 20 years ago, which ended up lasting 6 years.
yeah, massive. Yeah, and that uh, that also that pressure being applied to politicians to change laws to stifle, as you mentioned, the third party legislation, that pretty much impacts um, uh, organizations, as you said, market forces who are looking to take money. They target some of the contractors and the people that support the project financially, and has that been really effective? Do you think that was sort of the more of the political trigger that caused more politicians to come out and say we need to do something about it? Do you suspect that Adani were putting so much pressure on the Queensland and federal governments that was the thing that actually prompted them to start legislating?
Well, there's no secret that yeah,
Yeah,
Adani have donated to both political parties, and they've been to the Cash for Access, you know, events. Yeah, an interesting example of that is One Nation. Like One Nation Party were, originally very against the Adani mine, whether that was for racist or other reasons, we don't know. But Adani donated 50 grand to One Nation, and it wasn't too far later on that One Nation Party was supportive. Um, you know, it's sort of reasonably clear cause and effect there. And but the work that the Stop Adani movement done has been extraordinary, and it's been we know the corporate campaigning that's happened here has been viewed all over the world and has learned a lot, and the impact with regards to various organisations, focusing on insurers and banks, etc. Like, yeah, it is the corporate world is definitely not leading because they're being dragged to it. But in a country like Australia, we have the business community, well ahead of our government.
yeah, absolutely. And did I guess after all of that, all of the flare up, the confrontation, and I also spoke to people that I know from all over the world who knew about Adani. It became a symbol of sort of the climate struggle in a lot of ways. When did you first know that you were, they wanted to sort of, when you were served, I guess you were served papers, or did they notify you of a court action? When
No,
did,
they turned up at the door. So yeah,
yep,
my poor bloody wife opened the door,
yep,
and there was a dude with like, like big stack of folders all with legal documents. And yeah, I walked in and I knew exactly what it was. And yeah, my first thought was who else is actually being served at the same time, whether they were serving a whole lot of people, but it just ended up being me. But one of the torts that they've got is conspiracy tort. So it means that they can bring other people in, to the case at time. They may try that. So, but at the moment, it's just been myself. And then, yeah, we found out some of the tactics that they've been doing. And before that, there'd been secret Supreme Court cases, which I didn't know about, which was them applying to raid our home, like for 2 days. Like they were applying to court to raid our home for 2 days to search for evidence that I'd done this, that, and everything else, take electronics, all that sort of stuff. So, and the Supreme Court wouldn't let them. They went to the Court of Appeal, which again didn't let them. So then they, have sort of taken me on, in a more traditional way. But yeah, they actually seemingly, from what I can tell, have very little physical evidence to back up their, what are many
Mm.
ridiculous claims against me.
I guess it's like we'll see how far we can push this person. Be scare tactics are one thing. Anyone being served obviously has to think about as you mentioned before, your family and everything, um, which is which is significant. Has that helped to rally people around the cause? Do you think in the long run this is something that's going to backfire on Adani? You've like poked a
Um,
hornet's nest of people who are like, we're just everyday people caring about an issue. We
yeah,
care about
it's hard
climate.
for me to comment on
Yeah,
our legal strategy
yeah,
or the any sort of political strategy around that. But it is definitely a risk that Adani took, and people don't like bullies, and people don't like multi-billionaires who are bullies even more than that. Adani don't seem to care about their reputation in Australia very much anymore. They know that people either love them or hate them. So it's sort of got to that polarized, point where they're, happy to do some, reasonably or very aggressive, legal tactics that most companies wouldn't even think of. So yeah, but I don't try and dwell on it, too much. It's just a matter of getting good legal advice. But yeah, people have rallied behind me. So with regards to the crowdfunder, there's been over 9,000 people have donated, and that's almost $500,000, which is needed. Like this, litigation is ridiculously expensive. Adani would have spent way more than we have, and yeah, you need serious senior lawyers involved. And so, yeah, part of my challenge is to keep raising money, which I'm confident of doing, and I've got plans ahead. So, yeah, we definitely don't want to think them to think that they can just outspend me and I'll go bankrupt. So it's just a matter of keeping it in the public eye, raising the money, getting the best legal advice, considering, myself as well as the wider movement. And it's also precedent really important. So the SLAP suits, which stands for Strategic Litigation Against Public Participation, they fail in Australia. So, and this needs to fail. So that's really important as well, is that, ultimately there, we win the case if it gets that far, if it gets to a final, trial, which would be, massive. Yeah, we need to win it. And we need to win it not just for myself, but for people to, those to come.
mm. And this like obviously there's a federal election coming up, and a lot's at stake. You have a local mining billionaire spending a lot of money in this election, trying to disrupt the airwaves, and as you said, a lot's at stake. Do you think the like ultimately, um, uh, like projects like Adani, do you think ultimately it will collapse, and the work that you've done will be one of the major reasons for it? Because some of these projects are looking to be pushed out, will be operational for 50 odd years, and obviously the world's moving in a certain direction. Do you think it's just these projects just won't go ahead because of the pressure that like you have applied?
Well, yeah, I strongly believe that it's ridiculously unlikely for Clive Palmer or
Mm,
anyone else to get another, thermal coal project going in the Galilee Basin. So they would have to commit to throwing away money to do that. And yeah, and that's a massive success of Stop Adani. I would have loved it if they didn't get the railway line through, but having a 10 million ton a year mine, if it ever reaches that, compared to 60, and have that for they think they're saying about 25 years now when originally it was 90. It's just not going to happen. Like the concept that people will be, digging up and exporting and burning thermal coal for electricity, in 20, 30 years is just incomprehensible given the higher economic cost of doing that compared to renewables. And the world's changing, people are changing, the culture's changing. So, the same as how do you explain it? Like, I often, relate it to cigarettes as being a big cultural change with regards to smoking and advertising and pushing cigarettes, and what the cigarettes companies did was move to the third world. And that's what's, happening with some of the dirtier fossil fuels like thermal coal, which we don't need and is easily replaced, is that, companies involved are, pushing it in, whether it's India or China or, Indonesia or other parts of Asia, they're pushing their dirty product somewhere else and making the money what they can with regards to the investments they've made before it all falls apart. So
yeah, absolutely. And looking at like the people you've worked with and looking back over the years, how, as you mentioned that, this is sort of a long game. There's a long-term outcomes to what's happening now. Uh, do you have any advice for anyone, any of the young people who have, since 2019 or 18, I've noticed that there's been, climate really became a narrative, especially around the bushfires and so forth. And so many different people from so many different walks of life have gotten engaged politically that I never thought they would.
Yeah.
Is like, if you had any advice for someone getting involved, what would that be?
A part of it is, yeah, very much, stick to your values and, ethics, and vote with your values and with your ethics. And if, like, the Labor Party, for example, doesn't match where you think the world should be, don't bloody vote for them first. You can vote for them second and be strategic in that method. Or if you're going to get involved in a political party, get involved with one that meets your values and ethics and what you want for the future. And that generational change is, very important with regards to where the political system, moves. And if young people are voting Green, for example, early, they're more likely to continue doing that, over time. And a lot of the young people that were involved in the school strikes are voting for the first time this election. That's important. So yeah, that gives me, heart with regards to some of the mainstream political, outcomes. But for anyone wanting to get involved, it's not just young people, is like, try before you buy, and check out different groups, and, work with people that you can, get on with, and try and be effective and strategic as you can. And yeah, I don't know. It's People talk about self-care and that sort of stuff. Like, I'm getting a bit better at that. And I know not everyone has got that sort of calling and drive that I do. But yeah, look after yourself. Sometimes it's really hard to see the bigger picture. And sometimes it's really easy to despair because you see things getting worse or changing slowly. And, my I suppose my point on that is around, and what keeps me going a little bit, is complexity. Understanding that, ecosystems are very complex, individuals are complex, societies are complex, and we just don't know. We can't say that it's all going to fall apart in 10 years or 20 years or whatever. We just can't tell the future. All we can do is control what we can control, which is the best that, we can do, the environment that we're in. And, you know, stick with our, values and ethics, and focus on what's effective and strategic rather than sometimes what's more fun, and recognize that it's hard work. So it's yes, it's not all fun and beer and skills and creativity and whatever. Sometimes you've just got to do the hard slog in the background, whether that's, researching, or whether that's, knocking on doors, or, doing IT work, or doing design work, or, writing letters, or whatever it may be. Sometimes it is hard work. And, listen to those that have gone before as well, obviously, because people have tried and failed before you have. And there is an amazing amount of activist, wisdom out there, and, things that you can read, and ways you can approach things. And, it's extraordinary to see some of the past, and to learn from that, and, replicate it to suit new times and do better.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, Ben, thanks so much for having a chat today. And before you go, I like to ask people, do you have a favorite song from a campaign, or something that you listen to now that, or is there a go-to band that you really like, or a song that keeps you going?
Yeah, maybe others, like, politically, yeah, love Billy Bragg. And yeah, very much growing up in far western Sydney, there wasn't, there was AC/DC, Midnight Oil, and the Angels, I think, were the bands you could listen to. And I was a big fan of Midnight Oil from a very young age, and that definitely impacted me. Like, I know Peter Garrett's not the whatever he may be these days, but it was really important to me as a young person, sort of, getting access to that information and concepts and ideas, from the age of, I think I was 10 when I was first sort of engaging with Midnight Oil. But songs, because, yeah, I've had some reasonably challenging times. There's a song by Fugazi called "I'm So Tired," which I've been listening to a bit lately, and it's a
Yep.
bit melancholy and guy on a piano and whatever. And it's not particularly positive, but it's quite, powerful. And the other one, actually, it was actually, I saw Peter Garrett recommend it in an article, as Elvis Costello's song called "Shipbuilding," which is just, I've been listening to it quite a bit in the car on Spotify or whatever. It's such a powerful, beautiful song from the early 80s in the Falklands War. So, and it's about, and it relates to all sorts of, spaces in this area, I suppose. It's about, the coastal towns that, may have some shipbuilding going on because, of ships being sunk in the Falkland War, but they've also got the young men in particular from those communities coming home dead. So it's just this little thing about the, economic benefits from the war as well as it's killing our kids, and it's just a beautiful song.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, thanks, Ben. I'll make sure to put the clips in the comments, and I do appreciate your time. So, yeah, hope to check in with you soon, and we'll be monitoring the court case as it unfolds. But yeah, I wish you a lot of luck, and yeah, and I hope to check in with you sometime in the future to make sure we know what's going on.
Good, sounds good. Thanks, Tim.